All right, let's bring in Lance Leising. He's a former FBI supervisory special agent and a CBS News contributor. Lance, thanks so much for joining us. So let's talk about your assessment vis-a-vis the response from the various agencies that were involved here, the Secret Service, local police, the FBI. What did you make of the response to the shooter?
Sure. Well, first, let's talk about what went right. This was, they call it multiple things, concentric ring of security or layered security. So likely outside, there were restrictions on streets and parking garages. Then you had an ID check coming in the hotel. Then you had one of the last security checkpoints, which was the magnetometer and armed security. And the subject was stopped there by the heroic actions of the agents and officers involved. That was what worked right. However, it stopped at one of the last security checkpoints. That's where the subject was detained. So that requires a level of, to look at that. You want to really examine that closely because it was one of the last levels of security.
And Lance, we're also learning more about the suspect, who this person was. He wasn't really on law enforcement's radar. He didn't seem to have much of a record, if any at all. What more do we know?
Yeah, well, we know a lot, and the manifesto was one of the reasons we know a lot. Now, I would caution, though, a manifesto is really evidence more than it is an explanation. It's what the subject wants everybody to know as to what he was thinking and why he did what he did. However, investigators are going to be looking at everything, not just that manifesto. They're going to be reviewing online accounts, any associations he had, potential mental health issues, personal grievances, all of these things to try to see if this was more widespread or not. So the manifesto definitely helps investigators, will help prosecutors when it comes to trial. But right now it is evidence. So investigators need to keep an open mind and start digging. And that happened very quickly. The FBI was at the house in LA immediately, as well as the hotel room there in Washington, D.C. and other places.
You know, Lance, often in movies, there's a threat that is phoned in, and immediately, in the films, you get a phone call to local police calls the FBI gets in touch with Secret Service, and minutes before somebody can do something nefarious, he or she is stopped in their tracks. We know that in this case, that family members of the suspect did call into police and say that they had some concerns. Can you talk about, just from the federal law enforcement, how that would actually happen in the real world? You get a tip. Do you know where he is? How does that work?
First of all, it's assessing that credibility and immediacy of that tip, which is extremely difficult nowadays. There is so much rhetoric about conspiracy theories online and just blatantly out in the open that there are a lot of threats that come in. You got to assess that credibility. Does the individual have the means? Are they close? Do they have the proximity to do it? Are they really legitimate with this threat? And it takes a law enforcement agency to work together with others and take it seriously to take those steps. Oftentimes, the suspect hasn't taken steps. They've just made statements. And if those statements don't cross the line, there's nothing you can do. So it is very difficult. Really, what it comes down to are people that understand the individual that's thinking about a violent incident, seeing their changes, seeing them start to get weapons or really focus on the violent part of that grievance, and tell law enforcement ahead of time to give them time to work it. That's really what stops this, rather than the movies that make it immediate and an immediate stop.
And Lance, there's been talk about potentially elevating this event to a national security event. What does that mean exactly? And how does that type of security, like what we see at the Super Bowl, compare to the security that we had at the White House Correspondents Dinner?
Yeah, well, it adds a lot more authority for law enforcement agencies and a lot more resources going in there in order to lock it down. And what I would say, it varies from venue to venue. You mentioned Butler, Pennsylvania, very different venue, wide open. That shooter was able to get a line of sight on the protectee. Here, there's also, while it was a closed event inside, it was a multi-use facility. It was a hotel. So you have a lot of people with a legitimate right to be there, people who paid to stay in those hotel rooms, like the suspect did. So it added a layer of vulnerability into this venue that you can see was absolutely vulnerable. The suspect got that hotel room because he saw that vulnerability and allowed him to get close. What you would like to see in a national event is a closed facility, something where the entire facility is part of that threat landscape, and then you can lock it down a lot better. You don't have mixed use.
Does it matter, Lance, if one of the things that people, and this is interesting, my colleague Nate Burleson asked me this on CBS Mornings. He said, there's so many conspiracy theories out there about what happened, what didn't happen when it comes to this incident. And all I could think of was, we have a country now that is awash in guns and weapons. Anybody can get their hands on them, both legally and illegally. We have a mental health crisis, which is something this administration and previous administrations have tried to address. We have social media, which now you add that into the mix.
And fake videos and AI.
And AI, artificial intelligence. And so when it comes to this manifesto and the things that this suspect has written or alleged to have written, are we to think that this is just an isolated mental health incident when you factor in all those things? He bought those weapons legally. He's on social media, writing on social media. Or are we, as some are sort of lamenting, saying that there's a real problem with political violence in this country that needs to be addressed beyond those things? Those things just allow people to commit the violence, the mental health, the access to weapons, and that's the conversation we should be having. From an FBI perspective, I know you guys do a lot of assessing of the psychology of criminals and criminal minds.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I would say that's really the crux of this issue, is the dehumanizing of anyone on either side of the aisle, to get the subject to not feel that they are human at all, because what that does is there's a psychological barrier to hurting somebody. People don't want to do it. You don't want to see somebody hurt. It's just part of our nature. But if you dehumanize that person to a point where you feel morally obligated to go out and cause harm to that individual, then that breaks down that barrier. Everybody has grievances, but it's moving to that violent ideation, wanting to commit violence against another individual. That is what all this rhetoric makes it so easy for somebody with a regular grievance to move to violent ideation. And that's a step in law enforcement that we're really worried about. After that, it becomes planning and researching, but it's that violent ideation. It's so easy nowadays to want to do. And in this case, the suspect even said he was morally obligated to do it in his manifesto. He took it even farther. It wasn't just easy to commit violence. He felt like he had an obligation to commit that violence. That is what we really have to.
So then, but does that mean that then that person is mentally ill? Or that's what I'm trying to get at. We say that there's a mental health crisis. If you are so moved, as you describe, by the things that are happening, that are bubbling out there, that you are able to dehumanize somebody, and then you feel it's easier to carry out a violent act against them, is that mental illness? And because I suspect that they will probably use that as a defense.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe there's a mental health component to almost every active shooter incident. It's hard to imagine somebody who's rational and logical to move to the step of an active shooter, a mass shooting. Like even in the manifesto, he was talking about moving through innocent people, like taking them down in order to get to people he wanted to. That's not rational. That's not somebody who's got a complete mental health. Now, I'm not a mental health professional, but I do think mental health is a component in almost all of these.
All right, Lance Lysing, thank you so much for giving us a lot to think about.
Really interesting.